Hi, Jay Andrews here with Laguna Tools. Today we're going to do a setup on the 14CX bandsaw. This is a variable speed bandsaw that is the younger brother of our 18CX bandsaw. Your 14CX is going to show up on a pallet in a box with your shipping carrier. They're going to drop it off on your property and give you a shipping manifest to sign. Take a moment before you sign that just to walk around the box and make sure that there's no major shipping damage to the box. If you notice that there's shipping damage, make a note of it on your receipt, give a copy to the driver, keep a copy of that for yourself, and that way we'll have a record that there's some damage. Once you open the box and take the saw out, if there's damage to the saw itself, then we will need to file a claim for you. Give us a phone call within 48 hours so that we can file a claim with the shipping carrier to take care of your saw. Now that the box is open, go ahead and open up the flaps. Get all the components at the top of the box, starting with your manual. Get that set to the side, and then the rest of the components. Here's the fence extrusion, fence knuckle, hardware bags. Next up is the cast iron table. This thing weighs probably about 50 pounds or so, so if you can lift this up, great. If not, get somebody to help you lift it up and out of the box. You can see just how well this bandsaw is packed. This is the single heaviest part of the assembly, and it's something that you'll want to have somebody help you do. This is a real heavy piece, and rather than lifting the whole bandsaw out of the box, it's a lot easier to tip it out of the box. And so what we're going to do is cut the cardboard on the box and then stand the bandsaw up so you're not carrying the full weight of the saw. You'll want to slide the bandsaw down off the edge of the pallet so that when you do stand it up, it's not half on the pallet and half on the floor and wanting to tip over. To make this process easier, get someone to help you slide it down. And I like to prep for it so that I'm not standing it upright onto the styrofoam by just trimming and breaking away the excess styrofoam on the end. Now locate the hardware bags that came with your machine. In one of them you'll find the Allen wrench. The other hardware bag is going to contain the feet, the washers, and the bolt to install the feet on the bottom of the saw. Right now is the easiest time to install these feet on the bottom before you stand the saw up. Move the plastic up and let's install the feet. Installing the feet is pretty easy. They're preloaded with the washer. Simply just drop the bolt inside, grab your Allen wrench and screw them to the bottom of the saw. And repeat the process for the other three legs. Now it's time to stand the bandsaw up. Make sure that the plastic is pushed back, you've broken away all the loose pieces or protruding pieces of styrofoam, and get someone to help you. This bandsaw is heavy. When it does stand up, you want to make sure that it doesn't continue going over. So both of you lift and both of you hold on to the saw so that it doesn't tip over as you stand it up. Now that the bandsaw is standing upright, it's time just to kind of clean up the packing materials to make sure that it's safe for you to walk around and get the rest of the equipment on there. Let's get the plastic off and the styrofoam out of the way. The next step is to get the bandsaw off the cardboard and get the cardboard and pallet out of the way. The easiest way is to walk the bandsaw. Just tip it back slightly so you've got the weight of the bandsaw. And a couple of steps will get it off of the cardboard. Now it's time to install the table onto the bandsaw. It's a heavy cast iron table and it's greasy. They put the oil on it to protect it during shipping. So take a moment, cut the plastic off of the bottom and leave the plastic on the top so you don't get greasy when you install the table. Now with the plastic trimmed away on the outside edge, we're going to lift the table up and install it on the bandsaw. These two bolts that pivot inside the trunnions are going to mount into these two holes over on the bandsaw, and you want to make sure that as you drop the table down that these are free hanging and line up with those holes. You may have to jockey the table a little bit and reach in to make sure that these bolts go into the holes. Now, as you line the table up, get somebody to help you and hold the opposite end, and that'll give you a chance to check that the bolts are lined up into the trunnion holes. In the hardware bag, locate the two washers and then the two ratchet handles to secure the trunnions. First, install the washer onto the bolt and then thread the ratchet handle. I like to push up on the button and then grab the top of the ratchet handle to turn it into place. Now repeat the process on the front trunnion. Bolt started. You can clean the table with many different products. A good one to start with is WD-40. It cuts the shipping oil real well and lets you have a good look at the table. When you go to clean the miter slot, be careful, there might be some sharp edges in there from machining. I like to use a screwdriver with a rag. Get it wet with the WD-40, brake cleaner, or whichever cleaner that you're using. Put the screwdriver over the end of the rag and get in and clean that groove real well, including the T-slots on the side. Now that the table's cleaned up, let's go ahead and adjust it. Tilt it up. I just want to get it close to level, and then we're going to square it for 90 degrees later on. We're looking at the bolt that's on the bottom side here, and I noticed that the table was tilted inward on the inside of the throat there. So I'm going to take this bolt and make it a little bit longer by giving it a couple twists out. There is a jam nut to lock it in place after you're done. When we finally set up the saw and have a blade on it, we'll actually square it to exactly 90 degrees to the table, but I want to show you the bolt right now and get it approximately level so that we can continue with the setup a little bit easier. That's looking pretty good. I'm going to give it just a little bit more. There we go. Just want to get it approximately level. There we go. Just eyeball it, looks good. I'll tighten that down and continue with the setup. In your hardware bag, you're going to find a plastic handle that looks like this, and you'll want to grab a 14mm wrench and thread it into the crank handle on the side, and this raises and lowers this upper guide post. Thread it in by hand first, and then finally, once you get it close, tighten it down with the wrench. Now that your handle is installed, unlock the upper guide post by loosening the lock knob on the back and giving it a few cranks just to make sure that it spins free and clear. Now with the table installed, it's time to install the front fence scale. This is a little angle iron bracket that bolts to the front, and it adjusts from side to side with the slotted holes. There are tapped holes in the front of the table, and you've got two small bolts. Load one of those up insert it into the front of the table, and then finally tighten those down with an 8mm wrench. Tighten those down just finger tight so you can still adjust this from side to side. Get the next one started and repeat the process. Now I've left the scale loose so it can slide back and forth, and once I've installed the blade and the fence, I can go through and accurately mark where the 0 line is, adjust that, and then tighten it down with the 8mm wrench. You'll find the fence rail, and it has a large hole on one side, a small hole on the opposite side, and it's got holes on both ends. One end is about 4 1/4 away from the end. The other end is about 5 1/2 inches from the end. To install the fence, take the bolts from the hardware package, drop it through the large hole, and then slide one of the standoff sleeves onto this. We're going to go ahead and install the 5 1/2 inch end onto the inside or the frame end of the bandsaw. The short end will be on the outside edge. Line up the bolt with the threaded hole in the table. Get it started, but leave it loose so you can pivot it. And now install the second bolt and the standoff sleeve. Raise it up and tighten it down to the front of the saw. The front edge of the table has a recess that the standoff sleeve slides inside of. As you line that up, tighten it down with the Allen wrench. And you're ready to go. Now that the rail is on, we're going to install the cast iron fence knuckle. Make sure to back off the lock knob, position it over the end, and slide the outside edge into place. Now it'll glide back and forth across the table. The lock knob has a brass tip on it so that it doesn't score the bar. This is the fence face. It's an aluminum extrusion, and it has 2 T-slots, one on the back side and one on the bottom. It's a high-low fence, meaning that it can be installed low on the table like this, on the bottom T-slot, or it can be installed upright as a tall fence using the T-slot on the back side. Loosen up the lock knobs on the fence bracket, and then slide the T-slot right over to the bracket, line it up with the front, and then finally tighten down the 2 lock knobs on the back. There's a nylon slider built into the backside of the cast iron fence block, and it's adjustable so that the fence doesn't drag. Just insert an Allen wrench into the hole, give it a crank up or down, and this will allow you to go through and to make sure that the nylon is rubbing on the table and the fence isn't dragging. Now that the fence is installed, we need to check it to make sure that it's 90 degrees to the table. And we'll do that using a square, a machinist square. Put it up against the fence and the table. In this case here, I've got a little bit of a gap. Before you check it though, make sure that the lock knob up in the front is tight. With this tight, it'll let us reference the table and the fence to make sure that our adjustments are correct. This has got a little bit of a gap on the bottom, so I can either take the top back or the bottom out by adjusting the 2 little set screws on the back side of the fence. Before adjusting the screws, loosen the lock knobs so that the fence can move a little bit as you go through and make the adjustment. The set screws are right here. Drop those in. In this case right here, I'm going to push the bottom out, so I'll tighten that bottom screw just a little bit. It doesn't take too much, and you may have to do this 2 or 3 times to get the adjustment perfect. Once I've got that turned, I'll go ahead and pull this out, lock it back down, recheck the fence for the square. I'm close, but I have a little more to do, so I'll go back in. Like I said, you might have to do this once or twice. Now I'm going to adjust the top one and turn that in just a little bit and check it for square again. Once that's done, tighten down the knobs. Oh, that looks really good now. That's perfect. Now we've got the fence square to the table. We have to square the table to the blade. The first thing I'll do is crank up the upper guide post so that I can take out the throat plate insert. There's a Phillips head screw there. Loosen that. Be careful not to lose the screw. Next, take the plate out. And finally, remove the lock handle on the outside. This locks the two table halves together to make sure that it's flat as you're cutting. Get those removed. Make sure that the guides are opened up and backed off. They should come shipped that way, but just make sure that those are wide and widely spaced on both sides on the top and bottom. Let's get a blade and put it on the saw. The 14CX has an insert block that seals off this chamber so that it has better dust collection on the upper port. This just simply slides out. I'll set that on the table. Our blade will come right in through that same slot, and once the blade's in place, we'll put that back. I've got a blade selected, and I'm going to make a few adjustments here first. Open up the upper guide post cover. It's a magnetic cover. And then lower the wheel. There's a quick release mechanism on the back. And when you flip it to the down position where you can see it from the front, it should drop the wheel down. Now, occasionally on a brand new saw that's just shipped, some of the packing grease might be in there and it may not drop down when you pull the handle down. If it doesn't, what you want to do is grab on that wheel and pull it down till it lowers itself down and is ready to install a blade. You shouldn't have to do that every time, but sometimes on a brand new saw during the initial setup, you'll have to pull that down. Now it's time to uncoil the blade. I'll go through and uncoil the blade. I'm wearing safety glasses because these things have a lot of spring energy into them, and sometimes they can spring out at your face. This one was pretty easy today. Check the teeth to make sure that the teeth on the right-hand side of the blade, which is going to go through this side, are pointed downwards. If they're pointed upwards, flip the bandsaw blade inside out just by taking the blade, giving it a little spring, and then flipping it inside out. And again, with those bandsaw teeth pointed downwards, we're going to install the blade through the slot, and we're going to turn the corner on the saw and line it up right here. Now there's one thing you'll want to do is to lower this upper guide post, because you'll see that this magnetic tab is a little bit above the wheel. Drop that down to where it's even or below the edge of the wheel. It'll just make this installation a little bit easier. You'll also want to note that there's a gap on this side of the frame that the blade will slide into. Now that everything is positioned, I'll start centering the blade through the guides on the bottom, centering through these set of guides as I push it in, and gradually from the top down work on inserting the blade through each of the slots on the guard, on the guides, on the lower guides, and on the side of the frame. Taking a few moments to line this up now makes it easier as you move forward. Now on the bottom, slide the blade in, and just over the wheel there'll be plenty of slack on the bottom as I'm sliding it in. You'll want to center the blade on the upper and lower wheels as best as possible right now. Now that the blade is in place, use the tension handle to put a little bit of tension on it, and that's good. I still have to adjust this tension lever here, and I want to see it move the needle on the tension gauge. You can crank the wheel right now to apply a bit of tension to the blade. If you find that it's hard to turn, you can release some of the tension on the handle on the back, give it a few turns, and then reapply the tension by tightening the handle on the back. This is a 1/2 inch blade, and I want to see it come up to 1/2 inch on the gauge. That's going to get me really close. Now this gauge is adjustable because it's magnetic. I want to press on the blade with your finger, and with moderate pressure, you want to see about 1/4 inch of deflection. And moderate pressure is when the color of your fingernail is changing as you're pressing on the blade. This is the long side without the guides, so you'll see the most movement right here, but about 1/4 inch with moderate pressure is all that you need. Now I'll shut the upper guide post cover, and we're going to set the tracking now. And you have to do these adjustments in this order. You want to set the tension like we just did, and you want to set the tracking. And you set the tracking by spinning the wheels and making sure that the blade stays centered on the tire. If it's too far to the front or too far to the back, you can move the blade further forward or backward by adjusting the tracking knob on the back of the saw. And you'll do this by hand as you spin the wheels. Now that I have the blade installed and I've spun it a few times, I can see that it's tracking toward the front edge of the wheel, and I want to move the entire blade to the center of the wheel. And I'll do the adjustment as I'm spinning the wheel by finger right now. The adjustment is done in the back of the saw, and turning the tracking knob will move the blade forward or backward depending on the direction that you turn the knob. Standing at the side of the saw, you'll be able to see through the window at the blade, and you'll also see the tracking knob on the back. This is the tracking knob assembly. This is the lock knob. Loosen the lock knob so that you can make the adjustments. Rotating the knob counterclockwise moves the blade forward, and rotating the knob clockwise will move the blade backwards on the wheel. Make the adjustment while you're spinning the wheel by hand. So start turning the wheel and then turning the knob. In this case, I'm going to turn the knob clockwise, and you'll watch the blade move backwards on the wheel. I can move it pretty far back by turning the blade knob in, and then I'll ease it forward and get it centered on the wheel. Once I'm happy with the centering of the blade, I'll relock the knob here. Now the tracking is done. So we've done tension, tracking. Now it's time to adjust the guides. Before you adjust the guides, either the top or bottom, you want to make sure that everything that supports the guide is tight. In this case, the upper guide post is still loose, and it'll have a little bit of play, and that play is needed to move it up and down. Right now what we'll do is tighten up the knob, make sure that upper guide post is secure. Now I can go through and adjust the guides. The first step is to loosen this knob and slide the guides backwards on the guide post. This will expose the rear thrust bearing, which is a ceramic bearing. And now I'm going to loosen the guide post and slide this forward to where that ceramic is just barely kissing or barely touching that back edge of the blade. Now the blade is riding stable in that position. We want to use the guides to hold it stable. Just touch the back edge of the blade very lightly, lock that down with this knob, and now we're going to slide the entire assembly forward. You're going to want to be careful to make sure that the ceramics, which are going to touch the edge of the blade, don't come forward to the edge of the tooth or to the gullet. They want to be just behind that, probably about 1/8 of an inch or so behind the gullet. Then I'll lock this down. Now I'm going to bring the side guides in toward the blade, and these can pivot just a little bit. I'll bring those in to where they just touch the blade. You don't want to move or deflect the blade, but just come up and just barely touch the blade, very lightly. Lock the first one down, take the next one, and again push it inwards. Don't deflect the blade, and don't pinch the blade too tight now with the second one. Now that those are adjusted, I want to pull the blade through, and it should slide fairly easily through the saw. I want to pull it through just a few times to make sure that it doesn't bind, and I also want to make sure that the weld of the blade isn't so thick that it spans the gap there and causes a binding sensation. And this looks great. It's going through just fine. If your weld is a little bit too thick, you'll widen those guides out, probably just the thickness of a piece of paper, and that should take care of it. Now let's repeat the process on the lower guides. The lower guides are the same as the front portion of the upper guide assembly. This whole portion is repeated on the bottom, except for it's flipped over. This lock knob that slides the upper guide forward and backward on the guide post is repeated on the bottom, and it has the position to put the knob on the outside edge or the inside edge. On the bottom guides, that knob is on the inside so that you can tilt the table easily without hitting the knob, but that can be moved to the outside edge if you find that clearance is an issue for you. There are two lock knobs on the rear of the bottom guides. Loosen those. If you're having trouble doing these for the first time, you may want to do it with the table off until those are loosened up. Now that those are loose, I'm going to slide the entire guide assembly backwards. And finally, there's a lock knob on the back that lets me adjust the front section. Now, I'll bring these guides forward again to where they're about 1/8 of an inch or so behind the gullet of the tooth. I know it's hard to see in this position, but it's basically the same operation that we did on the upper guides, just in reverse on the bottom. Now lock this knob on the back side here, on the side. And finally, lock the rear knobs on the back. Now the guides don't go forward or back. We'll loosen that knob, push the thrust bearing forward to where it just touches the back of the blade like we did on the top. And again, lock that knob down on the side. And finally, bring the side guides into the blade, just barely touching it. Both the left and right, just barely touching the blade. Lock those down. Make sure it's against the blade. And finally, pull the blade through. Make sure that it doesn't bind, and make sure that the weld doesn't strike the ceramics and cause you any binding there. Now that I know that the blade is tracking great on the top and the bottom and is going through the guide smooth, we're ready for the next step. We're about ready to start the saw, but we need to put a few pieces back in. First is this insert block, and that goes right in to this area. It's a plastic block because it might touch the blade. It won't harm the blade because it's plastic. These do wear out and they are replaceable. You can get replacements at lagunatools.com or at your dealer. Next, let's reinsert the throat plate insert. That'll slide in from the back. This one's in pretty good shape. There are 4 leveling screws in the corner that you can go through and adjust to make sure that it's perfectly level with the table. This one is right on. I don't need to make any adjustments. So I'll reinsert the screw and tighten that down. Finally, take this lock handle, reinsert it into the gap on the side of the table, and then tighten that down. You can ratchet it to get it out of the way so you don't bump into it. Now that we have a blade installed and tensioned and tracked, it's time to go through and adjust the table to where it's square to the blade, and we'll do that with a square. Drop it on the table and bring it over, and we know it's out of square. We just roughly did that earlier. I've loosened the trunnion knobs, and you'll see that that adjustment is done just by tilting the table and getting that square. What we'll do is use the adjustment bolt on the far side that's underneath the table here to adjust this 90 degrees from the table to the blade. Using a 14mm wrench, adjust the bolt up or down the direction that you need to. Since we did a coarse adjustment earlier, we won't take too many turns to make this adjustment, but I need to raise the left-hand side of the table by giving this a few turns, checking it with a square. And once I've got this adjusted to where it's perfect, I'll tighten the jam nut. Just a little bit more. You can speed this process up by tilting the table and doing some of this by hand if you need coarse adjustments. I'll take a few turns by hand, getting it really close, and then finishing off the last little adjustments with a wrench as needed. And that is right on now. Now I'll tighten the jam nut. It'll be the same 14mm wrench. Now my table is square to the blade. Finally, I want to adjust the pointer so that it reads 0 at the bottom on the trunnion. It's a simple matter of loosening the screw on the pointer, rotating the tab pointing upward to where it's exactly 90 degrees. Get that put into position and then tightening the screw. Take your time to make this adjustment. It's a one-time adjustment to make sure that your table and your pointer are aligned properly. We've got all the basics taken care of on the saw. There's one final adjustment to do, and it needs to be done when the saw is running. We've set the tension, we've set the tracking, we've set the guides, and now we have to adjust the fence. The fence adjustment is a little bit different than the other ones in that certain blades cut different than other blades. One blade might cut a little more to the left, one might cut a little bit more to the right. You might have the blade a little bit further forward or further backward on the wheel, which can affect how it cuts. And that'll affect how this fence is adjusted. This is a dynamic adjustment. So what we'll do is we're going to start at the saw, make sure everything's okay, and then we're going to go through and do a test cut and show you how to adjust the fence. The first thing we want to do is power the saw up. When you first get your saw, this switch is probably pushed in. You'll simply pull out on this switch, and that should arm the saw and light up the LED here. Next, we'll go through and apply power. And because this is a variable speed bandsaw, we can actually go through and check and adjust the speed. This will go all the way down to some pretty slow speeds here, all the way on up. It also has a two-step pull in the bottom that we'll address in just a moment. But right now I'm just going to bring the blade speed up. I'll grab a piece of scrap wood to go through and sample against the fence, and then we'll make a test cut and show you how to adjust the fence. Now we'll get a piece of scrap wood. In this case I've got a piece of plywood, something flat with a flat edge on one side that you can put up against the fence, and then bring it over, lock the fence down, make sure that your trunnions are locked so that the table isn't moving. Now I'm going to make a cut a little ways into the piece of wood, probably 3 or 4 inches, and I'm going to stop the blade with the blade in the cut and leave it there to examine the back edge of the blade relative to the kerf so that we can adjust the fence. Let's go ahead and move that over, lock the fence, start up the saw, and finally, with the wood against the fence, bring it in and shut off the saw with the blade in the cut. Now what we're going to do is look at the back edge of the blade and make sure that it's centered in the kerf. If it's off to one side or the other, we will adjust the fence to make sure that it's centered in the kerf, and then make a second cut to verify that result. Now with the blade stopped, I'm looking at the back edge of the blade. If you need to do this with a feeler gauge, you can do that, but you can do it by eye as well. All you want to do is to make sure that you have the same gap on the left side and the right side of the back edge of the blade. The front edge, where the teeth are, made the kerf, and the back edge needs to ride in the kerf. If the back edge is rubbing on the board, it's going to try to steer the blade, and that's what we call drift. And to take that drift out, you'll adjust the fence. Now in this example, this one came dead on right out of the factory. But if you do need to make an adjustment, it's done with these bolts over here on the back edge of the fence. To adjust the fence for the drift angle, loosen up these bolts using the supplied Allen wrench, drop it in through the holes on the top of the fence rail, loosen the front, loosen the back, and I will loosen the center one just a little bit. I like to have a little bit of tension on that as I make the adjustment. In loosening those, it allows me to move the back edge of the fence relative to the front edge where the knuckle is, and then once I have it set, I'll tighten them down. Once you tighten these down, make a second test cut and a third or subsequent test cuts as needed to center the blade in the kerf. The last thing here is a one-time adjustment on this fence scale. Now that I've got everything adjusted, you can slide your board out that has the cut in it. If you've made several cuts, mark the one that has the proper adjustment to it. Lay it over the scale with the board up against the fence, and finally adjust the scale side to side so you can zero that out and then tighten the fence scale down. With the scale held in place, tighten down these bolts in the front. This is an 8mm wrench, and you just want to snug those up a little bit. And there we go. That's it for the adjustments. Now let's go through and cover operations and adjustments on the bandsaw. The 14CX is a variable speed bandsaw, and it has a high range and a low range. At the bottom wheel, you'll see that there's a system of pulleys here that lets you go from high range to low range. Before we make that adjustment, I'm going to push the power button at the top so that the saw can't start inadvertently. Next, I'll use the handle on the back to unlock the wheel and to take the tension off the belt and move the belt from the back pulley on the bottom to the front one and to the front pulley on the top as well. Loosen the tension on the motor. I open this handle, this unlocks it. Now you can raise the motor up to loosen the pulley on the front and move the belt to the front. When you raise the motor up, it loosens the belt. And to keep it loose, just use that little lock handle to lock the motor in the up position. And now come around front and take the belt, move it forward on the bottom, and then rotate the pulley and the wheel to move the belt forward on the top pulley as well. Keep your fingers out so they don't get pinched between the blade and the wheel or between the belt and the pulleys. Now that I can verify that it's centered on the top wheel and the bottom pulley, I'll go through and reestablish the tension on the belt. Loosen the lock knob and push the motor downwards. Tighten up the lock handle and just make sure that the belt is tight. Now that the belt is on the forward pulleys, the 14CX is in the low speed range. Let's verify that. First, let's go ahead and turn the power back on, turn the saw on, and then increase the speed. And you'll see that the top speed on low range is right around 15 to 1600 RPM. And you can slow this all the way down to a crawl. Your slower blade speeds are going to be used for cutting steel. Your faster blade speeds are going to be used for cutting wood. And your plastics and other materials are going to be someplace in between. You can refer to the speed chart to know what speed you should be using for the particular blade that you have on the saw and for the particular materials that you'll be cutting. This saw comes equipped with a foot brake that has a micro switch. When you step on the foot brake, it engages a disc brake system to stop the wheels and the blade. The micro switch shuts off the saw so the motor isn't turning. Let's test that system now. Make sure we're powered up, hit the on button, bring the speed up, and simply step on the foot brake, and the blade stops instantly. It's working perfect. The 14CX is a great saw. With the variable speed that this saw has, it lets you run into a wide range of materials with different blades to get the very best out of the saw. Now, the best saws in the world perform best with the best blades in the world, and you can get those at lagunatools.com. For metal cutting, we recommend a bimetal blade, and those are available in various tooth counts and various widths. Typically, for straight line cutting, you want the widest blade possible. That gives you more beam strength in the blade, and it puts more blade in the guides for a straighter, more accurate cut. For plastics and for woods and for other materials, you can go with our Pro Force blades, our Shear Force blades, and for the ultimate in resaw work, use our Resaw King blade. It is a carbide tipped, resharpenable bandsaw blade, and it gives you super smooth cuts and lets you peel off paper thin veneers very easily with this saw. Now, before you get started on your 14CX bandsaw, you may want to accessorize it, and we've got a couple of great accessories available. First off are work lights, and there are two mounting positions, one right here on the outside edge of the frame and one up here on the top of the frame, and you can install one or two work lights on your saw. The work lights mount into these existing holes, and they can plug into the outlet that's on the back of the saw. This is a 110 volt outlet, and it allows you to power up your light without having to plug it into the wall. It's powered up by the saw. One of the other accessories is a wheel kit. We offer a mobility system for the saw that bolts right onto it, and it's a dedicated mobility kit. While you're accessorizing your 14CX bandsaw, you may want to connect it to a dust collector system. There are two ports on the back. These are 4-inch ports. The lower one collects and cleans out from the cabinet. The upper one collects just as the dust is entering the lower cabinet at the top section here. Now, we've got a wide range of dust collectors, from small dedicated ones like our B-Flux dust collector, or you can go with a Cyclone like our C-Flux or P-Flux series dust collectors. Well, that concludes the setup of the 14CX bandsaw. Hopefully you can see just how versatile the saw this is and how easy the setup is of the saw. It's simply a matter of going through and putting a few components together, but the large portion of the saw is already built for you. If you have any questions, you can look us up on the web at lagunatools.com or give us a call toll-free 800-234-1976. Thanks again.